In the dead of night, the fluorescent buzz of the 24-hour laundromat stood as the only sign of life in the quiet town of Bridgerton. But beneath this mundane facade, a mystery was unfolding under the cover of darkness. Sheriff Tom Hollis, a man haunted by his own tragic past, couldn't shake the unsettling sight of a young black girl alone at the laundromat night after night. As he delved deeper into this puzzling situation, he had no idea that his investigation would lead to a heart-wrenching discovery that would change both their lives forever. What secret was this child hiding, and how could one little girl's struggle become the catalyst for healing a broken man's heart? Before we dive into this emotional journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The small town of Bridgerton nestled quietly under a blanket of stars, its streets empty save for the occasional stray cat or rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze. Most of its residents were fast asleep, their windows dark and curtains drawn. But for Sheriff Tom Hollis, the night had only just begun. Tom sat in his patrol car, parked at the edge of Main Street, his weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. At 53, he wore his years like a well-worn jacket, comfortable but showing signs of wear. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his blue eyes, though tired, remained alert as they scanned the silent town. For the past 5 years, Tom had volunteered exclusively for the night shift. His colleagues were more than happy to let him have it. Most of them had families to go home to, lives that flourished in the daylight hours. But for Tom, the night had become a sanctuary, a refuge from the memories that haunted him during the day. He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. As he set the cup down, his gaze drifted to the small photo tucked into the corner of his dashboard. A smiling woman with kind eyes and a little girl with pigtails beamed back at him. Sarah and Emily, his wife and daughter, the family he'd lost in a tragic car accident 7 years ago. Tom quickly averted his eyes, focusing instead on the empty street before him. This was why he preferred the night shift. The long, quiet hours alone in his patrol car suited his emotional detachment, allowing him to avoid the daylight and the deeper connections he'd long shut out. In the stillness of the night, he could pretend that the hole in his heart didn't exist. Bridgerton was a small town, barely more than a dot on the map. Its crime rate was low, and most nights passed without incident. That's how Tom liked it. He'd patrol the streets, check on the few businesses that stayed open late, and occasionally break up a rowdy gathering of teenagers. It was simple, predictable, and it asked nothing more of him than his presence. As the clock on his dashboard ticked over to 11:30 p.m., Tom started his engine and began his usual route. He drove slowly down Main Street, past the closed storefronts and darkened windows. The only signs of life came from the 24-hour diner at the corner and the laundromat a few blocks down. It was as he was passing the laundromat that something caught his eye. A small figure, barely visible in the dim light spilling from the laundromat's windows, was making its way towards the entrance. Tom slowed his car, squinting to get a better look. To his surprise, it was a young girl. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. She was black, with her hair pulled back in neat braids, wearing a faded blue jacket that seemed a size too big for her. In her arms, she carried a small bag that looked stuffed with clothes. Tom frowned, his cop instincts kicking in. What was a child doing out this late at night alone, and at a laundromat of all places? He watched as the girl disappeared into the building, the door swinging shut behind her. For a moment, Tom considered going in to check on her, but then he shook his head. She must be there with a parent, he reasoned. Perhaps they were just running late with the laundry. It wasn't his place to interfere in every little thing he saw. Still, as he drove away, Tom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. Something about the sight of that little girl, all alone in the night, stirred memories he'd rather keep buried. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the quiet streets ahead of him. It was probably nothing, he told himself, just a trick of the light, or his imagination playing tricks on him. Little did Tom know this seemingly insignificant moment would be the beginning of a mystery that would change his life forever. The next few nights passed in much the same way. Tom would make his rounds, and each time he passed the laundromat, he'd see the same little girl. Always alone, always at the same time, always carrying that small bag of clothes. She'd come from around the corner of the laundromat, making it difficult for Tom to see exactly where she was coming from. At first, Tom tried to brush it off. Maybe her parents worked nights and this was the only time they could do laundry. Maybe she just liked helping out. But as the nights went on and he never saw an adult with her, his curiosity began to grow. He started paying more attention, adjusting his route so he'd pass by the laundromat more frequently. The girl's routine never changed. She'd arrive just before midnight, slip into the laundromat, and stay for hours. Tom would see her through the windows sometimes, methodically sorting clothes, waiting patiently by the machines, folding each item with care. It was on the 5th night that Tom finally admitted to himself that something wasn't right. He pulled his car over across the street from the laundromat and watched as the girl made her way inside. This time, he noticed details he'd missed before, the way her clothes hung loosely on her small frame, the careful way she walked as if trying not to draw attention to herself, the quick, nervous glances she cast around before entering the building. Tom felt a tightness in his chest. This wasn't just a kid helping with chores, this was something else entirely. But what? As he sat there, wrestling with his thoughts, he became aware of hushed voices nearby. 2 women were walking past his car, engrossed in conversation. As they passed, Tom caught snippets of what they were saying. "That little girl again, every night like clockwork. I know it's not right, a child out at this hour. Someone should do something. Call social services or—" Their voices faded as they walked on, but their words lingered in Tom's mind. So he wasn't the only one who'd noticed. The town was starting to talk. People were getting concerned. And rightfully so, Tom thought. A child alone at night was cause for worry in any circumstance. But something held Tom back from taking immediate action. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter and how quick judgments could sometimes do more harm than good. Or maybe it was the quiet resilience he saw in the little girl, the way she carried herself with a determination that seemed beyond her years. Whatever the reason, Tom knew he couldn't just barge in and start asking questions. He needed to approach this carefully, to understand the full picture before he acted. But he also knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was going on with this child, and as the sheriff, it was his duty to find out what. As he started his car and pulled away from the curb, Tom made a decision. He would keep a closer eye on the situation, gather more information, and then decide on the best course of action. He owed it to the girl and to his own conscience to handle this right. Little did Tom know, his decision to investigate further would lead him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his town. The mystery of the little girl at the laundromat was just beginning, and it would take all of Tom's skills as a sheriff, and as a human being, to unravel it. The following night, Tom's patrol car rolled to a stop in front of the laundromat. He'd timed his arrival to coincide with the girl's usual appearance, and sure enough, just as he put the car in park, he saw her small figure approaching from around the corner. Tom watched as she entered the laundromat, then took a deep breath. He'd spent the day thinking about how to approach this situation, and he'd decided that the direct approach was best. He was the sheriff, after all. It was his job to ensure the safety of everyone in town, especially children. Stepping out of his car, Tom straightened his uniform and adjusted his hat. He wanted to appear official but not intimidating. The last thing he wanted was to scare the girl. As he approached the laundromat's entrance, he could see her through the large front windows, already busy loading clothes into a washing machine. The bell above the door chimed softly as Tom entered. The laundromat was nearly empty, save for an older man dozing in a chair in the corner, and the little girl who looked up briefly at the sound before returning to her task. Tom's footsteps echoed in the quiet space as he made his way over to her. Up close, he could see the frayed edges of her jacket, the scuff marks on her shoes. She looked even smaller than he'd thought, her movements careful and deliberate as she measured out detergent. "Hello there," Tom said, keeping his voice gentle. The girl froze for a moment, then slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, large and dark, met his briefly before darting away. She didn't respond, just stood there, her small hands clutching a t-shirt. Tom crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. "I'm Sheriff Hollis," he said, tapping the badge on his chest. "What's your name?" The girl's eyes flicked to his badge, then back to his face. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she took a small step back, putting the washing machine between them. Tom's heart ached at her obvious fear. He was about to try again when the bell above the door chimed. Both he and the girl looked up to see a black woman enter, carrying a large basket of laundry. "Hey, Imani," the woman called out as she made her way to an empty machine. The girl, Imani, gave a shy wave and a quiet hi in response. Tom stood up, relief washing over him. This must be Imani's mother, he thought. Of course, there was a simple explanation for all of this. The woman nodded politely to Tom as she passed, then began loading her laundry. Tom watched as Imani quickly moved away from him, going to another machine in the corner of the room. She kept her head down, focused intently on her task. Tom hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. His instincts told him there was still something off about the situation, but he didn't want to make assumptions. Maybe Imani was just shy around strangers. Maybe her mother trusted her to do the laundry alone sometimes. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't necessarily a cause for alarm. Deciding it was best not to push the issue right now, Tom gave a final glance around the laundromat. Imani was now sitting on a bench, her legs swinging as she watched the washing machine spin. The woman who'd greeted her was engrossed in a magazine she'd pulled from her purse. With a small sigh, Tom made his way back to the door. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. But what could he do? He had no evidence that anything was wrong, just a nagging feeling in his gut. As he climbed back into his patrol car, Tom's eyes were drawn to the photo on his dashboard. Emily's smiling face looked back at him, and for a moment he saw Imani's face superimposed over his daughter's. Both little girls, both vulnerable in their own ways. Tom started the engine, his mind racing. He'd thought this visit would put his concerns to rest, but instead it had only deepened them. As he pulled away from the curb, he made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the laundromat in the coming nights. Something told him this mystery was far from solved. The patrol car's headlights cut through the darkness as Tom drove away from the laundromat, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He'd gone in there hoping to find answers, to put his worries to rest. Instead, he'd left with more questions than ever. As he turned onto Main Street, Tom found himself glancing in his rearview mirror, the laundromat's glowing sign growing smaller in the distance. Something about the whole situation just didn't sit right with him. Sure, he'd seen another woman there, someone who seemed to know Imani. But was that enough to explain why a young child was doing laundry alone in the middle of the night? Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel as doubt gnawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if Imani really was in some kind of danger, and he'd just walked away? The thought made his stomach churn. He pulled over to the side of the road, his breaths coming faster as anxiety crept in. He'd been so quick to assume everything was fine, so ready to believe there was a simple explanation. But what if there wasn't? What if Imani needed help and he, the town sheriff, had failed to provide it? Tom closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. He thought about Imani's shy demeanor, the way she'd shrunk away from him. Was that just normal shyness, or a sign of something more sinister? And the woman who'd come in, she'd greeted Imani, yes, but had there been any real warmth there? Any sign that she was actually responsible for the child? The more Tom thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew. He'd made assumptions based on a brief interaction, and now he was questioning everything. What kind of sheriff was he if he couldn't even properly investigate a potential case of child endangerment? Opening his eyes, Tom stared out at the empty street before him. He couldn't just let this go. He had to know for sure that Imani was safe. If he was wrong, if everything turned out to be fine, Then at least he'd have peace of mind. But if he was right, if Imani was in trouble, well, he couldn't live with himself if he didn't do everything in his power to help her. Decision made, Tom put the car back in drive and headed towards the police station. It was time to do some real investigating. The next morning found Tom at his desk, surrounded by papers and his computer screen glowing with open tabs. He'd spent most of the night digging into records, trying to find any information he could about Imani or her family. But as the sun rose, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk, Tom had to admit that he'd come up empty. There was no record of an Imani matching her description in the local school system, no address listed under that name. It was as if the girl simply didn't exist on paper. Frustration gnawed at Tom as he rubbed his tired eyes. How was it possible that a child could be so completely off the grid? In a town as small as Bridgerton, everyone knew everyone else, or at least he'd thought they did. Determined not to give up, Tom decided to take a different approach. If official records weren't giving him answers, maybe the townspeople would. He spent the next few days talking to residents, especially those who lived near the laundromat or frequented it regularly. The responses he got were a mixed bag. Some people had noticed Imani, expressing concern about seeing such a young child out late at night. Others hadn't paid much attention, assuming she must be there with family. But no one seemed to know who she was or where she came from. One conversation in particular stuck with Tom. It was with Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment above the laundromat. She'd been doing her laundry late one night when she'd spotted Imani. "Poor little thing looked so tired," Mrs. Johnson had said, her wrinkled face creased with worry. "I offered her a cookie, but she just shook her head and went back to folding her clothes. It's not right, Sheriff. A child that age should be home in bed, not doing laundry at midnight." Tom couldn't help but agree. With each passing day, his concern for Imani grew. He found himself driving by the laundromat more and more frequently, always hoping to catch a glimpse of her, to reassure himself that she was okay, but Imani remained an enigma. She appeared like clockwork each night, went about her laundry with quiet efficiency, and then disappeared into the darkness. Tom never saw where she came from or where she went. It was as if she materialized out of thin air, existing only within the confines of the laundromat. As the days turned into weeks, Tom felt a growing sense of responsibility towards Imani. He couldn't explain it, but something about her struck a chord deep within him. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter, or maybe it was simply his instinct as a protector. Whatever the reason, he knew he couldn't let this go. The mystery of Imani had become more than just a case to solve. It had become a mission, a purpose that filled the empty spaces in Tom's life. For the first time in years, he felt truly invested in something beyond his nightly patrols. But with this newfound sense of purpose came a heavy weight of responsibility. Tom knew that if Imani was indeed in trouble, every day that passed without him taking action could be putting her at risk. The thought kept him up at night, haunting his dreams when he did manage to sleep. One particularly restless night, Tom found himself parked across from the laundromat once again. It was well past midnight, and Imani had been inside for hours. As he watched her small figure move about inside, methodically folding clothes and arranging them in neat piles, he felt a lump form in his throat. There was something achingly familiar about the scene. It reminded him of Emily, of the way she used to help Sarah with the laundry on Saturday mornings, his little girl, always so eager to be helpful, to be grown up. The memory, usually so painful, now filled him with a bitter-sweet warmth. In that moment, looking at Imani through the laundromat window, Tom made a decision. He couldn't stand by any longer. Whatever was going on with this child, he had to find out. He owed it to Imani, to his own conscience, and to the memory of his family. With a deep breath, Tom stepped out of his car and walked towards the laundromat. He didn't have a plan, didn't know exactly what he was going to say or do, but he knew he had to try. He had to reach out to Imani to offer her whatever help he could. As he reached for the door handle, Tom silently promised himself and Imani that he wouldn't give up until he uncovered the truth. Little did he know that truth would shake him to his very core and change both their lives forever. The familiar chime of the laundromat door rang out as Tom stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the rows of washing machines and dryers. Imani was at her usual spot in the corner, her small hands carefully folding a faded t-shirt. Tom approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hello, Imani," he said softly when he was a few feet away. Imani's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of fear. She took a small step back, her hands clutching the shirt to her chest like a shield. "It's okay," Tom said, crouching down to her level. "I'm not here to bother you. I just want to make sure you're all right." Imani didn't respond, but she didn't run away either. She stood there, watching Tom warily, her body tense as if ready to bolt at any moment. Tom's heart ached at the sight. What had this child been through to make her so guarded? He was about to speak again when something caught his eye. Imani's backpack, sitting on the bench behind her, was open. Inside, Tom could see not just clothes, but what looked like a small blanket and a worn, stuffed animal. Before Tom could process this, let alone figure out what to say, Imani suddenly sprang into action. In one swift movement, she grabbed her backpack, shoved the folded clothes inside, and darted past Tom towards the door. "Imani, wait!" Tom called out, but it was too late. The door swung shut behind her, the chime echoing in the now empty laundromat. Tom raced outside, his eyes scanning the dark street. He caught a glimpse of Imani's small figure disappearing around the corner of the laundromat. Without hesitation, he took off after her. The chase led him through the quiet streets of Bridgerton. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to keep Imani in sight. She was surprisingly fast for such a small child, darting between parked cars and cutting through alleys. As they neared the edge of town, Tom realized where they were headed. The old cemetery loomed ahead, its iron gate standing open like a dark maw in the night. Imani slipped through a gap in the fence surrounding the cemetery, disappearing into the shadows cast by the headstones. Tom hesitated for just a moment at the fence. The cemetery at night was a maze of darkness and hidden obstacles. If he wasn't careful, he could easily lose sight of Imani or hurt himself in the process. But the thought of leaving Imani alone in this place spurred him on. Taking a deep breath, Tom squeezed through the gap in the fence and entered the cemetery. The darkness seemed to close in around him as he made his way between the graves. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, provided only faint, shifting illumination. Tom strained his eyes and ears, searching for any sign of Imani. "Imani," he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. "Imani, please, I just want to help you." But there was no response. Tom moved deeper into the cemetery, his foot catching on unseen roots and his uniform snagging on low-hanging branches. With each step, his panic grew. Where could she have gone? How could such a small child just vanish into thin air? For what felt like hours, Tom searched the cemetery. He checked behind every large headstone, peered into every shadowy corner, but Imani was nowhere to be found. It was as if the night had swallowed her whole. Finally, exhausted and disheartened, Tom had to admit defeat. He made his way back to the cemetery entrance, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if Imani was hurt? What if someone else found her before he could? As he squeezed back through the gap in the fence, Tom felt a wave of failure wash over him. He'd had Imani right there, had been so close to helping her. And now she was gone, lost in the night, possibly in even greater danger than before. Tom trudged back to his patrol car, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his failure. But as he slid behind the wheel, he made a silent vow. This wasn't over. He would find Imani no matter what it took. He wouldn't rest until he knew she was safe. With one last look at the dark silhouette of the cemetery, Tom started his car and headed back into town. Tomorrow, he decided, he would redouble his efforts. He would leave no stone unturned in his search for Imani. Little did Tom know, the answers he sought were closer than he realized, and the truth would be more heart-wrenching than he could have ever imagined. The next evening found Tom back at the laundromat, his eyes glued to the entrance. He'd arrived early, determined not to miss Imani if she showed up. The events of the previous night had left him shaken, filled with a mix of worry and determination. As the hours ticked by, Tom's anxiety grew. What if Imani didn't come? What if his actions last night had scared her away for good? The thought made his stomach churn with guilt, but just as he was about to give up hope, a small figure appeared around the corner. Tom's heart leapt as he recognized Imani, her familiar backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked around cautiously before slipping into the laundromat. Tom waited, watching through the windows as Imani went about her usual routine. She seemed more subdued than usual, her movements slower, more hesitant. Tom's heart ached at the sight. He wanted nothing more than to go in there, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew he needed to be careful. He couldn't risk scaring her off again. So he waited hour after hour, as the laundromat slowly emptied of its other patrons. By the time midnight rolled around, Imani was the only one left inside. Taking a deep breath to steel his nerves, Tom finally stepped out of his car and approached the laundromat. He opened the door slowly, the familiar chime announcing his presence. Imani's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. But before she could make a move to run, Tom held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay, Imani," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you or take you away. I just want to talk. Is that all right?" Imani hesitated, her body tense as if ready to bolt, but after a long moment she gave a tiny nod. Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Slowly, carefully, he made his way over to where Imani stood. As he got closer, he noticed something that made his heart clench. Imani's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy as if she'd been crying. "Imani," Tom said gently, crouching down to her level, "I'm worried about you. Can you tell me why you're here all alone every night?" Imani's lower lip trembled, but she remained silent. Tom was about to speak again when he noticed something. Imani's eyelids were drooping, her small body swaying slightly where she stood. She looked utterly exhausted. And then, before Tom's eyes, Imani's legs seemed to give out. She slumped onto the nearby bench, her eyes fluttering closed despite her obvious efforts to stay awake. Tom watched in stunned silence as Imani curled up on the bench, using her backpack as a makeshift pillow. Within moments, she was fast asleep, her chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. The sight hit Tom like a physical blow. This wasn't just a child doing laundry late at night. This was a child with nowhere else to go. A child who had been using the laundromat as a safe haven, a warm place to sleep. Tears welled up in Tom's eyes as the full reality of Imani's situation crashed over him. How long had she been living like this? How had he not realized sooner? As he watched Imani sleep, memories of his own daughter flooded Tom's mind. He thought of Emily, of how small and vulnerable she had looked when she slept. He thought of all the nights he and Sarah had tucked her in, kissed her good night, made sure she felt safe and loved. And now here was Imani, another little girl sleeping on a hard bench in a laundromat because she had nowhere else to go. The dam broke. For the first time in years, Sheriff Tom Hollis broke down and cried. Silent tears streamed down his face as he sat on the floor next to the bench, keeping watch over Imani as she slept. In that moment, Tom made a silent vow he would help this child no matter what it took. He would make sure she never had to spend another night alone in a laundromat. He would give her the safety and security that every child deserved. As the night wore on, Tom remained at his post, his heart heavy with the weight of his realization, but also filled with a new sense of purpose. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to make things right for Imani. It was the least he could do for her and for the memory of his own family. Little did Tom know, this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek through the laundromat windows when Imani stirred. Tom, who had dozed off sitting on the floor, snapped awake immediately. He watched as Imani's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her features as she took in her surroundings. When her gaze landed on Tom, her eyes widened in fear. She sat up quickly, clutching her backpack to her chest. "It's okay, Imani," Tom said softly, his voice hoarse from the long night. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." Imani didn't respond, but she didn't try to run either. She just sat there, watching Tom warily, her small body tense and ready to flee at a moment's notice. Tom took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next could make all the difference. "Imani," he began gently, "I know you're scared, and I understand why, but I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid of me. I'm here to help you." Imani's grip on her backpack loosened slightly, but she remained silent. "Can you tell me why you've been sleeping here?" Tom asked, keeping his voice low and calm. "Where are your parents?" At the mention of parents, Imani's lower lip trembled. For a moment, Tom thought she might start crying. But then, in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it, she spoke. "Mum's gone," she whispered. "She got sick, really sick, and then she didn't wake up." Tom felt his heart breaking all over again. "Oh, Imani," he breathed. "I'm so sorry. What about your dad or other family?" Imani shook her head. "Just me and Mum. We came here for a better life, but—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Tom had to fight back his own tears as he listened. The pieces were starting to fall into place, painting a picture of unimaginable loss and struggle. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked gently. Imani shrugged. "Don't know, a long time." Tom nodded, his mind racing. How had this child managed to survive on her own for so long? And how had everyone, including himself, failed to notice? "Imani," he said, leaning in slightly, "what you've been through, it's more than any child should ever have to face, but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. I'm here to help you. Will you let me?" Imani looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Her dark eyes searched his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why do you want to help me?" The question caught Tom off guard. For a moment he wasn't sure how to answer, but then, looking into Imani's eyes, he knew he had to be honest. "Because," he said softly, "a long time ago I had a little girl too. Her name was Emily, and if she were in trouble, I'd want someone to help her, just like I want to help you." Something in Imani's expression shifted at his words. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a glimmer of hope, so faint it was barely visible, but it was there. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Tom reached out slowly, giving Imani plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Well," he said, "first we're going to get you some breakfast, and then we're going to go to the police station and figure out how to make sure you're safe and taken care of. How does that sound?" Imani hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a small step, but an important one. "Okay," he echoed, offering Imani a warm smile. "Let's get going then." As they stood up, Imani clutching her backpack and Tom leading the way, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. There would be questions to answer, paperwork to fill out, decisions to be made. But for now, in this moment, he had done what he'd set out to do. He had reached Imani, had gotten her to trust him enough to accept his help. It was a beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The drive to the police station was quiet, with Imani sitting in the back seat of Tom's patrol car, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Tom kept glancing at her in the rear-view mirror, still hardly believing the turn of events that had brought them to this point. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Tom could see Imani's body tense up again. "It's okay," he reassured her as he parked the car. "We're just going to talk and figure out how to help you. Nothing bad is going to happen, I promise." Imani gave a small nod, but her eyes were wide with apprehension as they entered the building. The station was quiet at this early hour, with only a few officers starting their morning shifts. Tom led Imani to his office, closing the door behind them to give them some privacy. Have a seat, Tom said gently, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Imani perched on the edge of the seat, her backpack still held protectively in front of her. Tom sat down, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. He knew he needed to get more information from Imani, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. Imani, he began softly, can you tell me a little more about what happened to your mum? When did she get sick? Imani's eyes dropped to the floor, her fingers fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. It was a long time ago, she said quietly. We came here from Haiti. Mum said we'd have a better life, but then she started coughing a lot. She couldn't work anymore. Tom nodded encouragingly, his heart heavy with each word. And what happened after that? We lost our apartment, Imani continued, her voice barely above a whisper. We stayed in shelters for a while, but then Mum got really bad. They took her to the hospital. She never came back. Tom felt a lump forming in his throat. I'm so sorry, Imani. That must have been so hard for you. What did you do after that? Imani shrugged, her small shoulders rising and falling. I didn't know what to do, she said, her voice small and hesitant. Mom always said people might send us back if they found out. I was scared. She paused, her brow furrowing as she searched for the right words. So I just stayed away, found places to sleep. The laundry place was warm at night. Tom listened intently, his heart aching at the simple, childlike way Imani described her ordeal. Despite her limited vocabulary and the halting manner in which she spoke, he understood all too clearly the fear, loneliness and desperation behind her words. The image of this small child, alone and frightened, navigating the streets and seeking warmth in a laundromat, was painfully vivid in his mind. You were very brave, Tom said gently, fighting to keep his voice steady. But you don't have to be alone anymore, Imani. We're here to help you now. Imani looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and searching. Promise? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I promise, he said firmly. Just then a knock on the door interrupted them. Tom called for them to enter, and a woman in a smart suit walked in. Sheriff Hollis? She said. I'm Monica Dawson from Child Protective Services. We got your call about a child in need of assistance. Tom stood up to greet her, then turned to Imani. Imani, this is Ms. Dawson. She's here to help us figure out what to do next. Is it okay if she asks you some questions? Imani nodded hesitantly, her eyes darting between Tom and Ms. Dawson. As Ms. Dawson sat down and began to speak with Imani, Tom watched closely. He could see Imani's initial reluctance, the way she gave short, quiet answers at first. But as the conversation went on, she began to open up more, especially when Ms. Dawson asked about her life before coming to America. Tom's heart swelled with a mix of emotions as he listened to Imani talk about her mother, about their dreams of a better life in America. He could hear the love in her voice when she spoke of her mom, and the pain when she recounted losing her. As the interview progressed, Tom found himself becoming more and more invested in Imani's future. He couldn't bear the thought of her being placed in a system where she might fall through the cracks again. She needed stability, care, and love, things that had been taken from her far too soon. And then, as Ms. Dawson was explaining the next steps to Imani, Tom had a sudden realization. It hit him like a bolt of lightning, clear and undeniable. He knew what he had to do. Ms. Dawson, he interrupted politely, before we go any further, there's something I'd like to discuss with you, in private, if possible. Ms. Dawson looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Sheriff. Imani, will you be okay here for a few minutes? We'll be right outside. Imani nodded, watching curiously as Tom and Ms. Dawson stepped out of the office. Once in the hallway, Tom took a deep breath. What he was about to propose was huge, life-changing even, but in his heart, he knew it was right. Miss Dawson, he began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. I'd like to apply to become Imani's foster parent, with the intention to adopt if possible. Ms. Dawson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Sheriff Hollis, well, it's a big decision. Are you sure about this? Tom nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know it might seem sudden, but I can't explain it. I just know that I'm meant to help this little girl, to give her a home." Ms. Dawson studied him for a moment, then a small smile appeared on her face. "Well, it's not a typical situation, but I can see how much you care for Imani. If you're serious about this, we can start the process right away. It won't be easy, and there will be a lot of paperwork and home visits, but—" "I'll do whatever it takes," Tom interrupted, his voice filled with determination. "Imani deserves a chance at a real childhood, at a family. I want to give her that." Ms. Dawson nodded. "All right then, Sheriff, let's go talk to Imani about this, shall we?" As they re-entered the office, Tom felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He looked at Imani, this brave little girl who had endured so much, and he knew in his heart that he was making the right decision. "Imani," he said gently, crouching down beside her chair, "how would you feel about coming to live with me? Not just for a little while, but maybe for good." Imani's eyes widened, a look of disbelief crossing her face. "Really?" she whispered. You want me?" Tom felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "Yes, Imani. I want you to be part of my family, if that's okay with you." For a moment, Imani just stared at him. Then slowly a smile began to spread across her face, the first real smile Tom had seen from her. And in that moment, he knew that both their lives were about to change forever. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Tom threw himself into the process of becoming Imani's legal guardian with a determination he hadn't felt in years. There were forms to fill out, background checks to pass, and home visits to prepare for. But through it all, Tom never wavered in his commitment. Thanks to his position as sheriff and the urgency of Imani's situation, Tom had been granted temporary custody of Imani while the formal processes were underway. It was a challenging adjustment for both of them, but Tom could see Imani slowly starting to trust him more, to believe that this new life might actually be real. It was during one of the required home visits that Tom met Imani's assigned social worker, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Thompson. As they sat in the living room of what was now Imani's home too, Tom could see the wariness in Imani's eyes as Sarah tried to engage her in conversation. "Imani," Sarah said gently, "can you tell me a bit about how things have been for you lately?" Imani's eyes darted to Tom, seeking reassurance. He gave her an encouraging nod and she took a deep breath. "It's different now," Imani said quietly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Good different, but sometimes it's hard to talk about before." Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He wanted nothing more than to wrap Imani in a hug, to shield her from any more pain. But he knew she needed to do this, to open up about her feelings in order to move forward. "You're doing great, Imani," he said softly. "I'm right here with you." Sarah smiled gently at Imani. "Can you tell me how things have changed since you started living with Sheriff Tom?" Imani's face brightened a little. "I'm not scared all the time anymore," she said, "and I have a real bed now. Sheriff Tom even got me my own blanket with butterflies on it." Tom felt a lump form in his throat at the simple joy in Imani's voice over something as basic as a blanket. "That sounds lovely," Sarah said warmly. "What else do you like about staying with Sheriff Tom?" Imani thought for a moment. "He makes me pancakes on Saturdays," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "And he reads me stories before bed, even when he's tired from work." Tom hadn't realized how much these small gestures had meant to Imani. He made a mental note to make sure he kept up with their Saturday pancake tradition. "It sounds like you and Sheriff Tom have developed a nice routine," Sarah observed. "How does that make you feel, Imani?" Imani's brow furrowed as she considered the question. "Safe," she said finally, "and happy. I didn't think I could be happy again after—" She trailed off, her eyes growing distant. "It's okay," Tom said gently, reaching out to pat her hand. "You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready for." Sarah nodded in agreement. "That's right, Imani. We can focus on the present and the future. Speaking of which, what are you looking forward to most about possibly living with Sheriff Tom permanently? Imani's eyes lit up. We're going to paint my room, she said, her voice filled with excitement. Sheriff Tom said I can pick any color I want. I think I want yellow, like sunshine. As Imani continued to chat with Sarah about her hopes for the future, Tom felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Seeing Imani slowly come out of her shell, hearing her talk about a future filled with hope and simple joys, it was more than he could have ever hoped for when he first found her in that laundromat. Imani, Sarah said as their session was winding down, you've been incredibly brave, but you know you don't have to face things alone anymore, right? Sheriff Hollis here wants to give you a permanent home, a family. At this, Imani looked up at Tom, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Really? She asked, her voice small but filled with longing. You really want me to stay? Forever. Tom felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He moved to kneel in front of Imani, taking her small hands in his. Yes, Imani, he said firmly, I want you to be part of my family. I know I can never replace your mum, and I would never try to, but I promise to love you, to protect you, and to give you the home and the life you deserve. For a moment, Imani just stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face as if looking for any sign of deception. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'd like that. Tom felt his heart swell with joy. He looked up at Sarah, who was watching the scene with a smile. So what's next? He asked, his voice filled with determination. What do we need to do to make this official? Sarah's smile widened. Well, Sheriff, she said, we've still got some paperwork to complete, and there will be a few more home visits. But from what I've seen today, I think we're on the right track. Imani needs stability, love, and understanding, all things that you seem more than capable of providing. As they continued to discuss the next steps, Tom felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at Imani, this brave little girl who had already endured so much, and he knew that he would do everything in his power to give her the life she deserved. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. There would be challenges ahead, hurdles to overcome. But looking at Imani's face, seeing the hope that was beginning to blossom there, Tom knew that it would all be worth it. This was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chance to heal, to grow, and to build a family together. And Tom was ready to embrace every moment of it. The months that followed were filled with both challenges and triumphs. Tom threw himself into the process of becoming Imani's legal guardian with a determination he hadn't felt in years. There were mountains of paperwork to complete, interviews to attend, and home visits to prepare for. But through it all, Tom never wavered in his commitment. Imani, for her part, began to slowly open up. As she settled into life with Tom, her quiet demeanor gradually gave way to glimpses of a curious, intelligent child. There were difficult moments, of course. Nightmares that left her crying out in the night, moments of fear or uncertainty that would cause her to retreat into herself. But with each passing day, Tom could see her beginning to trust, to believe that this new life was real and lasting. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Tom's house, now their house, Imani looked up at him with serious eyes. Sheriff Tom, she said quietly. She still called him that sometimes, a habit from their early days. Are you sure you want to keep me, forever? Tom felt his heart clench at the vulnerability in her voice. He knelt down in front of her, looking her straight in the eye. Imani, he said firmly, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are my family now, and that's forever, no matter what. Imani's eyes welled up with tears, but for once they were tears of joy. She threw her arms around Tom's neck, hugging him tightly. I love you, Dad, she whispered, the word Dad still new and precious on her lips. Tom hugged her back, his own eyes misty. I love you too, sweetheart, so much. The day of the adoption hearing finally arrived. Tom stood in the courthouse, his hand holding Imani's tightly. As the judge reviewed their case, Tom found himself holding his breath. This was it, the moment that would make their family official. Having reviewed all the evidence and testimonies, the judge said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I am pleased to approve this adoption. Congratulations, Sheriff Hollis and Imani. You are now, in the eyes of the law, father and daughter." The courtroom erupted in applause as Tom swept Imani up into a huge hug, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. It was done. They were a family. As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright sunshine, Tom looked down at Imani, his daughter. She was smiling, her eyes bright with happiness and hope for the future. "So, Imani Hollis," he said, his heart full of love, "what should we do to celebrate?" Imani thought for a moment, then grinned. "Can we go to the laundromat?" she asked. Tom raised an eyebrow, surprised. "The laundromat, are you sure?" Imani nodded. "It's where you found me," she said softly, "where our family started. I want to remember it. But this time, as a happy place." Tom felt tears prickling at his eyes once again. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Hand in hand, they walked towards the laundromat, ready to create new memories to replace the old. The laundromat looked different in the daylight, Tom thought as they stepped inside. The harsh fluorescent lights were softened by the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the hum of the machines seemed cheerful rather than lonely. Imani led him to the bench where he had found her sleeping all those months ago. They sat down together, and for a moment they were both quiet, lost in their memories. "You know," Tom said softly, "I used to think this place was just a reminder of sad times, but now I think it's a symbol of hope. It's where our story began." Imani nodded, leaning against him. "It was real scary before," she admitted, "but now it's kinda special, 'cause I met you here." Tom wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. As they sat there, he marveled at how far they'd come. The quiet, frightened girl he'd discovered in this very spot was now his daughter, still quiet at times, but growing more confident and happy with each passing day. Over the next few weeks, Tom noticed a change in himself as well. The weight of grief that had been his constant companion for so long began to lift. He found himself smiling more, laughing at Imani's jokes and looking forward to each new day. One sunny morning, as Imani was getting ready for school, Tom made a decision. It was time to face something he'd been avoiding for years. "Imani," he said over breakfast, "how would you feel about visiting the cemetery with me this weekend? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Imani looked at him curiously. "Who?" Tom took a deep breath. "My first daughter, Emily, and my wife, Sarah. I think it's time I introduced you to them." Imani's eyes widened, but she nodded solemnly. "Okay," she said softly. "Can I bring flowers?" That Saturday, they stood hand in hand before two well-tended graves. Tom felt a familiar ache in his chest, but it was tempered now by the warmth of Imani's hand in his. "Sarah, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is Imani. She's our daughter now. I think you would have loved her." Imani stepped forward, placing a small bouquet of flowers on each grave. "Hi," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you, but I promise I'll take good care of Dad. We'll take care of each other." Tom felt tears rolling down his cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of sorrow. As they walked back to the car, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. His past and his present had finally reconciled, and he could look to the future with hope. As time passed, they developed their own rituals and traditions. Every Saturday morning, they would go to the laundromat together. It wasn't because they needed to do laundry there anymore. Tom's house had a perfectly good washer and dryer, but it had become a special place for them, a reminder of where their journey together had begun. One such Saturday morning, as they sat on the familiar bench watching the machines spin, Imani looked up at Tom with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said, the word still bringing a warmth to Tom's heart every time he heard it, "do you ever think about what if you didn't find me that night?" Tom wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think about it every day," he admitted, "and every day I'm grateful that I did find you. You've brought so much happiness into my life, Imani. I hope you know that." Imani smiled, snuggling closer. "You saved me," she said simply. Tom shook his head, feeling the familiar prick of tears in his eyes. "No, sweetheart, we saved each other." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Tom reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the lonely nights of his past to the joy-filled days of his present. From the scared little girl in the laundromat to the amazing young woman beside him now. Life had taken them both on a difficult path, full of loss and hardship, but it had also led them to each other, to this family they had built together. And as Tom sat there, his daughter by his side and a future full of promise ahead of them, he knew that every step of that journey had been worth it. In the end, it wasn't just about a sheriff discovering why a little girl was at the laundromat every night. It was about two lonely souls finding each other, about healing and hope, and about the incredible power of love to transform lives. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of unexpected family and newfound hope. If Sheriff Tom and Imani's story touched you as deeply as it did us, I've handpicked another story I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it now.